Hello, I want to present to you a thesis that claims that the works of Tolkien are actually more realistic than the works of George R. R. Martin, and especially the show Game of Thrones. So, how can that be the case? One might ask. Is this guy crazy? How can it be the case that George R. R. Martin's work that present the medieval warfare in all of its realism and barbarity and also show things such as rape, how can it be true that such work is less realistic than Tolkien's work that is all about mythology and Christian values? Well, I would argue, as some others would also argue, that Tolkien's work, precisely because it is closer to mythical Christian values of the medieval times, is actually in some crucial aspects closer to the uh, mind of the medieval person than a Game of Thrones and the Song of Ice and Fire, that if not explicitly then implicitly promotes liberal values onto the medieval world, and therefore it kind of loses realism in some aspects. I'll explain what I mean later, but let us start by emphasizing some crucial differences that exist between Tolkien's work and George R. R. Martin's work. George R. R. Martin, in one of his interviews, actually says that when he was a child and he read LOTR, that he was very disappointed that after Gandalf died, that Gandalf was resurrected from the dead. Like Jesus, Gandalf came back even stronger. And okay, I do understand where George R. R. Martin is coming from a perspective of realism and creating tension within a story. It might not be a good decision to have Gandalf be resurrected from the dead. But Tolkien was not aiming to create tension and realism in a sense that he simply wanted to imitate reality. Tolkien was trying to infuse Christian values and mythology into his work, and the concept of Eucatastrophe is crucial for understanding Gandalf's death and Tolkien. Eucatastrophe is an event in literature uh, in which the good guys they lose against the more powerful evil forces, but then something miraculous and good happens, and the resurrection of Christ is such an event. So it's not about realism, it's about sending a message and infusing your work with Christian values. It's about good against all odds triumphing against a much more evil force. That is the crucial message of Lord of the Rings, and precisely by pursuing such a message, Tolkien created a work that was closer to the mind of the medieval person. Medieval people would like Tolkien's work much more than the works of George R. R. Martin, and in its values, LOTR managed to be much closer to how the medieval person, medieval average guy, actually thought about the world. So, and yes, on the one hand, Tolkien does not kill so many of his main good characters. In fact, Boromir is pretty much the only one, the only main good guy. Let's call him a good guy. He's a very great character that dies. But yeah, again, so Tolkien is not more realistic in a sense that he imitated the medieval world more realistically, but he infused it with Christian values that are much closer to the medieval mind. A great example of that is Aragorn becoming the king, and therefore, in a perfect way, imitating the medieval trope of a true king that has a right kind of blood in him, that is therefore noble and good and actually cares for his people. Such beliefs were often to be found in medieval peasantry that believed that good kings that lowered their taxation were actually true kings that had the right kind of blood in them. While George R. R. Martin, what's interesting, and I would argue he's doing it uh, implicitly, and the show might even be doing it explicitly, Game of Thrones, presents to us Daenerys as a medieval Lincoln, as a figure that actually has liberal values, that wants to actually abolish, some would say even feudalism, definitely that wants to abolish slavery. And yes, a medieval abolitionist movement would be a then good name for Daenerys, and some would argue that her being so progressive in such a backwards world actually does not make that much sense, and that here the George R. R. Martin's work is desperately trying to present modern values as something that existed in the medieval times. And yes, I do agree that at least implicitly viewers of the show start to view Daenerys as a medieval version of Lincoln, but a much bigger flaw, and this is not a flaw that exists in the books because the books are yet not finished, and I strongly hope that one day they will be finished, but who knows. So a legitimate criticism of the show is definitely that it presents to us something that's actually very backwards and bad in the context of a medieval society as something good, because today in our liberal society, especially in the United States, people view it as something good, and I'm talking about decentralization of the state. The show basically ends with feudal lords gaining more power, so they essentially now have the right to choose the king, which is how the Holy Roman Empire also worked. A Holy Roman Empire was basically medieval Germany, and let's just say it did not result in happiness and prosperity for an average person. It just resulted in kings constantly refusing to just recognize the results of an election. Feudal families would vote, and then one guy would say, well, you bribed all the other guys, now I have to wage war on you. And of course they were bribed, everybody was bribing the feudal lords, and then the church would also bribe them, and it was just pure chaos with political players from the outside trying to bribe the feudal lords, and then some people would then just secede and say, well, okay, then you can have your empire, I'm seceding. So decentralization in the context of a medieval state is something very bad and catastrophical, but the writers of the show decided to view medieval society through the prism of the United States, where people today in the United States are kind of obsessed with this idea that small government is good. And the main difference between A Song of Ice and Fire and Tolkien can be seen in if we more closely analyze the unfinished work of Tolkien called The New Shadow. Now, what I find fascinating about this work is that Tolkien actually attempted to write a sequel to Lord of the Rings called The New Shadow. And the premise of this sequel that was unfinished, and I'm going to explain why it is unfinished. The premise is that an ordinary citizen of Gondor that still remembers the hard times when the people of Gondor were fighting against Sauron, and he is one of the older people, is now looking at younger generation with sadness and bitterness, and realizing that they have forgotten the evils of Sauron, and they have forgotten the values of Gondor, and are now even masking and imitating orcs in some aspects. And Tolkien recognizes that in many ways he was inspired by his experience in the First World War and by his son's service in the Second World War. And this story definitely echoes the, let's say, warnings that people of the older generations used to say about younger people, that they have become spoiled and forgotten how evil fascism is, and are losing their liberal values. And I do think that Tolkien also agreed with such a message. So the story opens with Borland, this average citizen of Gondor, seeing that teenagers, Gondorian, let's say, young adults, teenagers, are stealing fruits from the garden of his neighbor, and he warns them, and he tells them to stop, because only orcs do such evil work. Only orcs steal and destroy their neighbor's fruit. To which the kids, or I should say the young adults, decide to engage in a sophistic debate with him and convince him that actually there are much bigger problems in the world, such as people destroying trees. And they argue, aren't the humans actually, aren't all humans as bad as orcs if we look at them through through the eyes of the trees? And Borland still remains determined, and he argues, no, you have forgotten the evils of Sauron, and you are now acting like orcs, he tells them. To which the kids respond by telling him that they have become members of a new evil sect that wishes to gain power and rule over Gondor, and they invite him to their secret meeting, and Borland decides to accept in order to see what the hell is going on in his homeland, and in order to try to actually save Gondor from this evil conspiracy. And this story was meant as an let's say an allegory or an epic tale about the society destroying itself from within, with no clear good guys and bad guys, with no clear battle of good versus evil on a cosmic scale, as it was with Sauron and let's say the good guys such as Gandalf and Frodo and the elves. In this world there are only men that remain, men and hobbits, because it is happening after Lord of the Rings. But Tolkien in the end said that he simply realized that he actually does not want to write this work because it was almost too realistic, and in Tolkien's eyes this type of work would lose its mythological strength, and it would no longer be a myth. It would be a realistic story about a decay of a society from within. And Tolkien simply did not want to do that. He realized that he wanted to preserve the end of Lord of the Rings as this mythical, bittersweet ending that actually can be described as more or less a happy ending that still ends on this fairy tale / mythical note. And that is actually a main difference between Tolkien and George R. Martin, because George R. Martin surely would have written such a sequel, and a part of me also actually desperately wants to see that sequel, because the premise is definitely intriguing. But yes, all in all, that was a theory about how Tolkien is actually in some crucial aspects more realistic than George R. R. Martin that I wanted to share with you. And don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more videos like this.